mark scheme for this particular paper. Just thought it'd be useful to give you an idea of how to answer these sorts of questions, and particularly concentrating on the grade and the mark structure for a 5, 8, 10, 12, 15. So the first question here was to explain the concepts of real GDP measured in purchasing power parity and the concept of living standards. So you had to try and explain what these two meant. So I was going to give you some heads up on these 5 markers, that the examiner normally gives you a K, A and A for these. There's no evaluation for a 5 marker, but importantly the marks are allocated in different ways for each 5 markers. So sometimes it's 2 Ks, 2 analysis, 1 app, or you might get 2 marks for application, 2 for analysis and 1 for K. So your safest bet is to try and work through, can I give them 2 pieces of knowledge, 2 analysis points and 2 application. And so as you can see here, you've got to be able to distinguish real GDP, and real is the volume of output in the economy, it's the physical number of goods and services, it's GDP at 2015 prices, and you could call it the nominal that has been adjusted for inflation as well. So I was accepting that. PPP is simply a measure that is used where they're comparing 2 baskets of goods that can be bought in 2 different countries to compare the living standards between the 2 countries. And there's a short video on that if you want to know what is meant by PPP and how they work it out. And lastly, the living standard is some measure of the quality of life. There's no agreed definition in economics about living standards, but it's some idea of quality of life rather than the number of physical goods being produced. And you could talk about it as material well-being. Real GDP per head is where they start, or gross national income per head as well. But there's some adjustments that are made for population equality and pollution, etc. Lots of things that you could have put in there to explain that difference between the the physical number of goods and services being produced, and then whether that translates into an increase in the living standards, the quality of our life. And I was going to give you 2 application marks, so 3 marks for any of that knowledge, and then 2 application marks, because really when you looked at, here I'll show you over here, you can see, oops, gone too far, you can see that you had GDP figures here, you had the purchasing power, you could have mentioned any of those, and then per head of population, and there was so much in this case study. There's emissions, there's pollution, etc. That you could have used for the application back here for that first 5 marker. So you really got to learn to get into the case study and use the data that you're given. Often the answers are found in the case study. Okay, next one was this 8 marker, which is 2 factors that affect the international competitiveness of an economy. And remember, with 8 markers, they are marked by basically knowledge, analysis, application, evaluation, and then repeated. So it's 2 times KAAE. Okay, and the evaluation can either be 2 small pieces for each chain of reasoning, or it could just be 1 developed and evaluation for just 1 of them. So that's the way that is marked, these 8 markers. So the knowledge here, international competitiveness, start with a definition. It's you use relative unit labour costs, which is relative wages, that's the wages in one country compared to the wages in the other country, and relative productivity as well. Okay, so don't forget to get that idea in. It's about the relative costs. They also include export prices, inflation rates, terms of trade, which is the price of exports, price of imports. The analysis would be identify a reason and then link it to the competitiveness. So you might say how wages or non-wage costs compare to other countries, and because it just says affects the international competitiveness, you could go it improves it or it worsens it. So if you were saying wages, a rise in the wage of one country compared to another country would increase its relative unit labour costs, which would therefore worsen their competitiveness. So you've got to link the analysis to the definition of competitiveness in some way, and this is where I would say any economy is going to do here. Okay, you had some examples in this one, but you could just do any economy. It doesn't say this, it just says an economy. And you've got to know snippets of information about wage behaviour in the UK, that some people are bidding up wages because of the cost of living and the strikes that are going on, and therefore, if wages rose in this country compared to others, then our competitiveness would have, decreased. The exchange rate, you should know that since the Brexit vote, it has fallen, which improves our competitiveness, productivity. Any of these things, you've got to get some snippets of information in there for the application, and the evaluation then would be, for example, you can prioritize the factors. This is an important one, this is the least important one, but you could also talk about short, long run. You could say the exchange rate might in the short run affect productivity, but competitiveness, but productivity is a long-term problem, and that's going to have a bigger effect in the longer run, something of that nature. Or you might evaluate by saying wages might go up in one country, but they're also likely to go up in another country because of the cost of living, and so therefore relative wages are going to stay the same. Any sort of evaluation is needed for these little 8 markers. Okay, the 12 marker, well, we put it in there because I thought that would be a really nice, easy one. And it does say whether an increase in tariffs. Now, if this comes up, then you tend to have a tariff and then you increase the tariff. I've shown you the diagram when that doesn't happen, because that's the one that most of you used. But really, is it always beneficial to a country? So this is as I say over here, this is a 12 marker. So this is marked with 8 KAA and 4 evaluation points. There's no need for a diagram because it doesn't say using, well, it says using examples, but it's obviously easier if you do it. And because it says country, you could have split it into, the consumer and the firm, any of those. And because it's assessed, then you could, do the government as the evaluation. But basically, these are the things that we're looking for. It raises the cost of imported goods, which raises the price for consumers. You can see it in this diagram here. Price was that, now it's that. That reduces the consumer surplus by this whole area here. Okay, that reduces real incomes as well for those who are buying imports. Okay, so it has really quite a negative effect on consumers. Therefore also imports are going to fall. So this is the old, this is the new. So that's a benefit to the country possibly. But also the firms in the country applying the tariff will increase their output. So any country that is putting a tariff on like this one will increase the output from this level here, and the increase in the industry, the firms in this country, is going to rise, and so they're going to have a rise in the producer surplus, which is this area here, and so that is going to be beneficial for jobs, etc. The government gets some revenue, and that can improve their fiscal position. You don't want to go on with that one because this is only a 12 marker, so you're making 2 points, and each one is only worth 4 points, okay, 4 marks, so don't spend a lot of time on it. But the welfare, you could have talked about government and welfare together, a loss of surplus outweighing the gain in the producer and the government. So in other words, you end up with these 2 welfare loss triangles, which I'm showing you there in the diagram. So you really could have milked this one for, this could be a 15 or 25 marker, but you've got to know the benefits and costs of putting on a tariff and taking off a tariff. Really important for the exam coming up. Valuation, obviously when the prices are going up, that might be raw materials that we put a tariff on, and so that leads to inflation in this country. it means the companies are therefore less competitive, and they might, lose their sales overseas. The other country where we've put a tariff on against them, they might retaliate and put a tariff on, which is what China did against America, and so therefore that reduces the exports, so the impact on the balance payments isn't going to be as great. The effect on the consumer surplus, remember this area here, depends on if it's inelastic demand, inelastic supply in this particular market, and so you could talk about that as well. So there's a lot that you need to talk about in terms of the evaluation. Please remember, this is a particular market. This is not real output and average price level here. Some are making that mistake. It's an actual market. It's it's the market for cheese or something like that. That we're looking at here. It's a microeconomic market. So hopefully that's useful for you. This one caused disappointment, really, in the sense that I was expecting most of you to use this diagram, because it did say, with the help of it, ADAS assess the impact of an increase in injections, and back here it says generate multiple increases in GDP, and back in the case study, when you read these lines, it refers to the marginal propensity to consume. So that should have been hinting to you that this is the multiplier effect going on. So injections, any money received by one party, okay, that has not then been paid to it from the other party. So it's coming from outside the circular flow. An injection comes into the circular flow, doesn't get passed around the circular flow. You could have defined it and defined the multiplier effect. But this is the key diagram, that when you talk about the multiplier, you've got to be able to explain. I'll go down here first. The analysis leads to an increase in injections, leads to an increase in expenditure, that's C plus J. Therefore, that's put into the firm sector. Firms increase output, then they pass that increased output on as higher income, and it is that higher income then, it says here, the income is then spent by consumers, and there's a further increase in expenditure coming from the C bit. So in this diagram here, the first shift is because of the injections going up. The second shift is because of consumption going up. So that's really important that you get that over to the examiner. Some people use that if it was injections and they were talking about investment, they shifted the aggregate supply curve. That's not quite what we were looking for, but it was acceptable. It was good, economics. It was logical, and so I gave the marks for that. The application, really anything that you were going to say about an increase in government spending or change in exports, or an increase in investment. So you could have talked about HS2 and the government increasing investment in that way. So you've got to know what's happening in the economy in those to get that application. The evaluation, of course, is the multiplier effect depends on the multiplier value. So the value of the multiplier is the number you get. The effect is then the effect of increasing J on the increase in real national output, the final increase in that. So you could have talked about the multiplier value and the initial change. You could have talked about the marginal propensity to consume, which it mentions in the case study. You could have talked about the marginal propensity to withdraw. Anything really here. And you need to know, what is happening to the savings ratio, which is the marginal propensity to save. What is happening to taxes, marginal rates of tax. So these are important things, though, that you need to get hold of. These little, as I say, snippets of information, so that you can talk sensibly about them. The effect of that shift it depends on the shape of the AS. So whenever you shift an AD curve, the first evaluation will always be how much it shifts by, and then secondly, what's the shape of the aggregate supply curve. So and you can talk about it really in terms of spare capacity and output gaps. That's the best way. And being in alternative theory, Some would say, well, the increase in aggregate demand, if you're using the classical model of a long-run aggregate supply, which is vertical, has no effect, because the question was the increased injections on the GDP, and so you'd say it has no effect in the long run on GDP. Okay, so hopefully that gives you where we were looking for 10 marks. And this one, again, just going to hint this to you. This was a question really about should the government prioritise economic growth, and these are the reasons why. They even put that in the question, but the case study is full of context about the costs of economic growth. And so in this sense, the analysis, what a lot of people did was they started the analysis by saying they should prioritise, because you get higher living standards, more goods and services are produced. Raising growth leads to rising income, more jobs through higher employment. Unemployment falls, poverty goes up. Bring in the fiscal dividend to the government, mention the 3 taxes, the tax on income, the tax on spending, and the tax on profits. Okay, and that might be then spent on public goods and merit goods, etc. And even if you're talking about what those are, that's some application. The application in Costa Rica, it says they're able to spend more on health and pensions and education. It was there in the case study for you. And then increased growth also leads to an increase in investment. Now that's called the accelerator theory. It's not on the syllabus, but if you'd brought that up, that would have been fine. We'd have accredited you with that. But really, when you look at they should not prioritise growth, there was so much in the case study: inequalities, climate change, social relations, health, free time, whether it's sustainable growth, use of the renewables and non-renewables, life expectancy, the ecological footprint they mentioned, carbon neutral, defence spending was not to be doesn't get added. All of those things are actually mentioned in the case study. And if you think it's a 9 and a 6, then if you can bring more context to this part here, then you should have really used they should not prioritise as the analysis. So I don't think they should, and then bring in all that context and then give the evaluation as, however, there's an argument to say that they should. So try and think about that when you're planning the work. If you know more about one of those points, like yes they should, no they shouldn't, use that for your analysis. So hopefully that helps, and the next 2 videos will be on the essays that you had to do.